In this video, we're going to add Lucia Auth to a simple CRUD application we built in a previous video with SvelteKit and Prisma. If you haven't seen that video, but you're already familiar with Prisma, don't worry, it's a very basic setup. And as our example app currently stands, anyone can edit, add, and delete articles. And our goal by the end of this video is to add authentication and authorization to this app so that only authenticated users can create articles and only the creator of that article is able to delete or edit it. Now, I would say that Lucia Auth definitely isn't a super beginner-friendly library, so I want to kind of go over a couple of the high-level concepts here before we dive into the code so you can understand what's happening behind the scenes. So Lucia implements what is called session-based authentication, which is a method of authentication where the user's session is stored on the server and used to verify their activity. So the first user login request may look something like this. A user may post their credentials to a login route. Our server will then get the user by their username and then verify their credentials here inside of the server. And then if everything is good to go, what it will do is it will actually create and store the session on some type of data store. This could be a Redis instance running. It could be a SQL database. It doesn't really matter. And that session tends to look like this. This is essentially like the bare minimum you would need for a session. You usually have a session ID, a user ID that links that user that just logged in to this given session, and then some type of expiration date or period. So once that's been created, it returns the session back to our server, and then we go ahead and do whatever else we want to do with inside the server before we return the response back to the client. And then we also will pass the set cookie header in our response with the auth session cookie and the session ID or some obfuscated version of the session ID here that we will pass to the browser. And then the browser doesn't have to do anything to accept it, but it will use it on subsequent requests. So then on subsequent requests, we make a request to, let's just say, get a protected resource. We have this auth session cookie here that's being passed along with our request, and it has that session ID. Our server is first going to check, since it's a protected resource, it's going to try to get and figure out who this user is and if they have permission to even access this page. So it'll reach out to the data store, get the session by ID, since we do have the ID or some variation of it here in this cookie. And then the data store will then return the session. We can check to see, do they have the right permissions based on the user or whatever, and then we'll return the response. So that's kind of how the flow would go at a very high level. And then we have one last demonstration here before we dive into the code. I promise, I hope I'm not making you fall asleep, but this is kind of how Lucia handles the data behind the scenes and how we're interacting with these different things. You're going to see some of these terms here in a few minutes, and I don't want you to be confused. So as we just went over, you're familiar with what the sessions are, right? This is what they kind of look like here, but we also have users and we have keys. So users are pretty self-explanatory. That's your user object. That's your users that are being stored in the database. But then you also have these things called keys, right? And before we can create a user, we have to have at least one key. And a key is basically a way that a user can be authenticated. So let's just say that in our application, we have the ability to either log in with email and password, or we have the ability to log in with GitHub. So when the user first registers for an account, let's just say they sign up with email and password. So we create a key, and this key here, this first part before this colon here, is arbitrary. So in this case, we're going to set this to email because we're signing them in with an email. But if we were doing a username, we could say username. If we were signing them in with their social security number, we could put SS in here. It doesn't really matter. And then whatever password they signed up with, it's going to hash and store that here. And then it's also going to link that to the user. And then you have this primary here, which we'll get to in a second. So let's just say that me@me.com doesn't use the application for 2 weeks and forgets if they signed in with GitHub or email. So they decide to sign in with GitHub. Well, we'll be able to detect on our application, does this email here already exist? We already have a user with this email address. If we do, then we don't want this user to create a whole nother account with their GitHub login. We want to link this GitHub login to the same user. So now this user can sign in with either GitHub or their email. And we could repeat this process for Facebook, Twitter. So essentially you can choose whatever you want to log in with, and you're still going to be the same user in our database. Now, this is where the primary key comes in here. So you see we have this primary property here, and it's false for GitHub and true for email. So there has to be at least one primary, right? And that's the one that can't be deleted without actually deleting the entire user at the same time. So for our example scenario, since we signed up with email, we could unlink our GitHub or unlink our Facebook if we had one, and those would be fine, but we can't actually delete the email key without first changing another one to the primary key. So these keys are related to users, and then different sessions are related to users. So you might be wondering, okay, why do we have two different sessions here? Well, let's just say that I log into my account on my iPad, and then I also log in on my desktop computer. Those would be two different sessions, right? Those are two different clients that are accessing the site. So when I go to sign out of one of those, it doesn't sign me out of all the devices. There is an option to do that, but by default, we're just going to be signing out of that specific session, just as you would expect from any other application. So that is a rough high-level overview of how Lucia is working behind the scenes. to kind of clear up some confusion before we dive into the code. So now let's actually integrate this into our application. All right, so we first need to install a few packages in order to start to integrate this into our app. We have Lucia Auth here, we have the Lucia Auth SvelteKit library, and then we also have the adapter Prisma, which will allow Lucia to work with Prisma. So let's go ahead and install those now. And then once those are installed, we can come into the Lucia documentation in the Prisma section here. And if we scroll down a bit, it'll let us know what our schema needs to look like. And we can see here we have the user, the session, and the key, which are those things we just went over. So let's just go ahead and copy these over to our existing schema, and then we'll talk about them there. All right, so this is what my schema currently looks like. We still have our article here, but we also have user, session, and key. Again, we've already went over these different models here, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but what I will do is I'm going to add a couple different columns to this user model. So the first thing I'm going to add is name, which is basically going to be the user's name. And then we'll also have username, which is going to be also a string and unique. And this is what we're going to use to log the user in this example. And then now that we're done with our schema modifications, we can actually push those changes to our DB. And then we can run npx prisma generate, which generates the client. And then what I typically like to do is I just go to any TypeScript file and restart the TypeScript server, because sometimes it takes a second for Prisma and TypeScript to sync up. All right, so now we should be able to initialize Lucia. So let's just create a new file in lib/server called lucia.ts. And we're gonna have to import a few things, one of which is gonna be Lucia from Lucia Auth. We're also gonna need to import Prisma adapter from the Lucia Auth adapter Prisma. And then we're also gonna import dev here from app/environment, which comes from SvelteKit. And then we'll also import our own Prisma client here from lib server Prisma. And then now to actually initialize Lucia, we can export auth, and it's going to be set to Lucia, which is going to take in an object. The first property here we need to pass is the adapter, and that's going to be our Prisma adapter, right, that we just imported. And what this takes in is a Prisma client. So we're going to pass in our existing Prisma client here. And the next thing we need to take in is the environment. And we're actually going to use this dev helper here, which basically allows us to know if the dev server is running or not. So if it is, so if dev is true, we're going to set the environment of Lucia to dev. Otherwise, we'll set it to prod. And now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to do transform user data, which takes in user data. And I'll explain what this means in just a second here. But it's going to return an object. And this object is essentially going to be what we want our user data to look like. So whenever we go and request the user from Lucia, when we say, hey, Lucia, get me this user based on this session ID or whatever, by default, it's only going to return the user ID. And in some cases that will suffice. But in our case here, I also want the username and the name of the user. And those are the two properties that we added to our schema here, the name and username. So we can add those here. So we'll have user ID, which is what is going to be by default, but we need to add it here since we're making a change. We'll also have username, which is going to be userdata.username. And then we'll also have name, which is userdata.name. And you can think of this user data here as the database object of the user. All right, so now that we have that, we need to export type auth, which we're going to use in just a second here. And it's going to be a type of the auth that we just created here. And that's all we need to do to initialize Lucia. Now let's go ahead and integrate it with our SvelteKit application. And we can do so by creating the hooks.server.ts file. And Lucia provides a function called handle hooks, which comes from their SvelteKit library. And that handle hooks takes in auth, so we need to import our auth there from lib server Lucia. And then this handle hooks can actually act as our handle function. So we can say export const handle, we can pass the correct type here, and that's going to be equal to handle hooks auth. And right away, you're going to notice that we have some red squigglies here, TypeScript's mad. And that's because this handle hooks actually sets a few different methods that we use to actually interact with our database and verify and validate users. And TypeScript doesn't know about them yet. And we can actually set those inside of our app.d.ts file here. So I'm just going to paste these here, but you can feel free to pause the video and copy these in. Again, these are just the different methods. We're going to use each one of these later on. I just wanted to kind of clear up that TypeScript error. And this is how we can set up these types so that TypeScript knows what we have inside of locals. And then while we're here, we might as well also declare the Lucia namespace to get type safety on the other parts of Lucia as well. So let's just put that right here. And all of this information is in their documentation site. We're going to reference the Lucia auth types and then declare a namespace. One thing to note here is this user attributes type. If you recall, this essentially aligns with the things that we added to our user. So we added username and name. So we need to make sure that these are here too. And if you decided to go with email or whatever else, you need to make sure those are here as well. So you have type safety throughout your application. So now when we go back to our hook, we can see that we're no longer getting any TypeScript errors, but something else you might be wondering is, what if I want to add some other custom stuff to my hooks? Am I pretty much screwed? Well, no, you're not. We can actually take advantage of SvelteKit sequence function, which allows us to pass in multiple handle functions that run in a sequence. So what I'll typically do is I'll just set up a generic custom handle here that that I will pass into this sequence. So this is what the generic handle looks like. And then we can actually change handle from handle hooks auth to sequence handle hooks auth, comma, custom handle. Just make sure that the handle hooks auth comes first. And then we need to import sequence from SvelteKit. And there we go. So any other custom hook logic you need to add can go within this custom handle here. All right, so now that we have our hook set up, let's go ahead and add the registration functionality to our app. And we're going to do so inside of the register pages plus page.server. And we're going to start out with the load function. So logged in users shouldn't be able to access the register page because they're already logged in, right? So we can add a quick check here that will redirect users with a valid session to the home page. So we can do that by just saying session equals await locals.validate. And this validate method here will either return a session or a null. So in this case, if they have a session, we want to throw a redirect to the home page. Next, we can set up the default action because we're only going to have one action on this page, and we'll just need to take the request here so we can get the form data that is being submitted from this register form here. So as typical, we will just destructure name, username, and password from our form data object. Now you always want to validate user input. I'm not going to do it so here because of the fact that that's not the focus of the video, but in your application, please validate with something like Zod. Never trust user input. All right, so let's now open up a try catch block here so we can catch any errors that occur. And in order to create a new user, we need to use the auth object that we created earlier. And we'll say auth.createUser. And it's going to take in an object. And the first thing we have to create is a key. And you recall we went over keys earlier, how those are the ways that a user is able to authenticate, and a user has to have at least one key to exist. So it's going to take in a provider ID, and this value here is arbitrary, and that's the first part of that ID. So we can pass in username here since we're going to be logging in with username. But if you were doing GitHub or email, you could pass email there. It's really only for yourself to reference. And then we need to pass in the provider user ID. So what links this user to this type of ID? So if this was GitHub, it might be the GitHub email. If it was an email, it might just be the email. But in our case, since we're doing username, we're just going to pass in the username that the user passed into their form. And then it also needs a password. In this case, it's going to be the password that the user passed in as well. And then it also takes some attributes, and those are those user attributes we set up. So we're going to have to pass the name and the username because those are the two fields we added on to our user object. And those both come from the form. And then we'll catch and log and return fail for any errors. And then if everything goes well, we will throw a redirect to the login page so that the user can now log in, right? Because we're not going to create the session when they register. We want them to create an account and then log in afterwards. Okay, so now that we have this set up here, let's actually go ahead and try to register a user. So let me go to my application here. It should be running, and I can go to the register page, and let's just try to create a user here. All right, I was redirected to the login page, which is a good sign. We didn't get any errors in our console. So we can't log in yet because we haven't added that functionality. So let's do so now. And I'm going to do that inside of the login page.server. I'm first going to set up a load function to protect logged in users from accessing this page, just as we did on the register page. And then again, I'm going to use the default action here because we're only going to have one action. We're going to take in the request. We can get the form data, but we're also going to take in locals because we'll need one of those methods on there to actually validate the user passed in some valid credentials. So we'll go ahead and get the form data out. We're going to have a username and a password. And then inside of a try catch block, we're first going to say key equals await auth, which we need to import from libserver Lucia, dot validate key password. And the first thing it wants is the provider ID. And if you recall, that's the value that we set. So in this case, our provider is username. And then the provider user ID is what maps to that provider, which in our case here is going to be the username that the user passed in. And then it wants the password, which is the password the user passed into the form as well. So if this key exists, meaning that if everything goes well, if it's able to properly validate it, we're going to actually create a session. So we can say session equals await auth.create session. And we're going to pass in the key.userID, which is our user's user ID. And then we need to set locals.setSession. This is the method on locals. And what this will do is it will set the session in the response object so that when it goes back to the client, it has that set cookie header with the auth session. And we'll demonstrate that here in just a second. So let's just pass that session here. And then we'll catch, log, and return fail on any errors. And then we'll just redirect the user to the home page once they are authenticated. So now we should be able to log in to our application. So let me log in with that user I created a few minutes ago. And we were redirected to the home page, which is a good sign. If I open up my cookies here, we can see that we have this auth session cookie that was set with a value here, which is great, right? That means we passed the cookie back, so we're going to send that on subsequent requests. And then we can actually check our auth guards here. If I try to click on register or login, I can't get there. And if I try to navigate directly to them, I can't get there either. So that means our auth guards are in fact working. We are not allowing authenticated users to access either the register page or the login page, but we're still showing these icons here. So let's actually go ahead and make sure these are hidden if a user is logged in. So right now our client doesn't know whether we're logged in or not. Only our server does. We can pass some information from our server to the client via a load function. session to make that happen. And I'm going to do so inside of the layout.server.ts file. So inside this load function here, I'm going to take out locals. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the user and session from await locals.validate user. And up to this point, we've only used the locals.validate method, which just returns a session, but the validate user returns both the session and the user, so we can access that here. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to return the user. And just to be clear, this isn't some type of auth check. We're simply going to return the user object from our load function, whether there's a valid session or whether there's a valid user or not. This could potentially be null, and that's okay. This is strictly for us to use it with our UI and hide things and show things given a user's state. So then inside of my layout here, I'm going to come down to where these register and login buttons are, and I'm going to say if not data.user. So if there's no user, I want to show these buttons. If there is, I do not. And if we save that and then come back to our browser, we can see that we no longer have the login and register buttons here. And while we're on the topic of layouts, let's go ahead and add the login button. And I'm actually going to set up a form here to handle the logging out. So it's going to go to an endpoint. We'll just say method equals post here. And I'm going to wrap this whole thing in a form. And that's because I'm using Pico CSS and the styling's a bit strange. But basically, we're going to have if no data.user, we want to show these. And then we'll also set up an else here. So otherwise, if there is a user, we'll have another LI with a button, and this button will have its own form action, which is going to go to /logout. It's going to be of type submit, and we'll have logout here. So now we have a logout button that we're going to be able to use to log out. So if we come back to our browser, we can see we have home and logout now. So since we're on the discussion of logout, let's go ahead and set up the logout endpoint now as well. And this will be set up inside of the routes logout plus server.ts file. And the first thing we need to do is we actually need to get locals from here. And we're going to get the session. So if there's no session, that means they have nothing they can even log out from, right? So we can just throw a redirect to the home page because they're not logged in anyways. And then if there is a session, we need to run await auth, which we need to import .invalidate session. And you can see here they have invalidate all user sessions and invalidate session. If you recall earlier how I mentioned that you can have multiple sessions that can be logged in on one device or another. Those are two different sessions. So in this case, we can invalidate all user sessions, which will log the user out of everything, or we can just do invalidate session. So in this case, I'm just going to invalidate the current session, and then I'm going to pass in the session.session ID. And then what I'll do is I'll do a locals.set session to null. That way our auth session will be deleted from our cookies in our browser. So we're not sending some invalid session ID with our future requests. And then lastly, we'll just redirect the user to the home page. So let's test this out. So if I look here at my cookies, right now I still have the auth session. And if I click log out, we'll see that the cookie went away. And then if I log back in, we now have the cookie here again. So now we have the basic authentication implemented. Let's finish this up by adding authorization to our app. And if you recall the goals we set at the beginning, we want to only allow authenticated users to create articles and only allow users to edit or delete articles that they created. Now to make this happen, we first need to update our schema.prisma file. We'll need to add a one-to-many relationship between our user and our article tables. And since we have the Prisma for VS Code extension, all we have to do is go into the user model here, and I can simply say articles. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say article with an array here, and then I'll save, and you'll see that this is populated here. Now it has them optional by default, but we're going to actually make those required. We don't want any rogue articles floating around with no user. So we'll remove those there. And then we need to push these to our database, and we can do so with npx prisma db push and then npx prisma generate. And I will also restart my TypeScript server as well, just to make sure that is good to go by coming into any TS file, Control-Shift-P, and then restart TS server. All right, so we can now add authorization logic to our home page's actions, which is where the create and delete actions live for our articles. So if we go into the root page.server.ts, we'll see that we have the actions here. So starting with create, we also need to destructure locals from this. And we want to fail fast. So if we don't have a user, we just want to go ahead and redirect them before we do anything else. So we'll just get the user and session because we will need the session and the user for this. And then if we don't have both a user and a session, we want to redirect them. And then if you notice here, TypeScript's already kind of mad at us right now because it knows that an article needs something else. And because we just made the user ID required, we need to pass that here as well. So we can come down here, go to user ID, and then take in the user.user ID here. And then for delete, we can do the same thing that we did up here where we fail fast. We can just copy this and bring it down here. We'll need to take in locals, of course. Now deleting is going to be a bit different, right? Because we first need the article to know if this user owns the article. And right now we're passing the ID of the article we want to delete through the search params. But other than that, we don't know anything else about that article. So what we can do is we can come down here and we can set up a Prisma query. We can say find unique or throw. So basically if this doesn't exist, we just want to throw an error. And we'll say where the ID is number ID. And again, that logic was already here. So if an article doesn't exist, it's going to throw. So we don't have to worry about checking to make sure an article exists. But what we do want to check, we want to say if article.userid is not equal to the user.userid, then we want to throw an error of not authorized here, basically saying, hey, you don't own this article, you can't delete it. And then everything else can remain as it was. Now this should cover the authorization for creating and deleting articles. And since we can't create an article if we aren't logged in, we should probably just go ahead and hide the new article form here. So let's log out. We can still see this. We should probably hide that. So we can go into our page.svelte here and come down to this new article form. And we'll just say if data.user, then we want to show it. If not, you're not going to show anything. So now if we look here, we don't see that form. Then we also have a few buttons here. We have the edit and delete article buttons. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to hide those as well. So I'll just come up here above this form and I will say if article.userid is equal to the data.user.userid, so the currently logged in user, we want to show these action buttons. If not, we will not show them. So we do article.userid and data.user.userid. And since data.user could possibly be null, we need to add a question mark here. Okay, so let's just log in and create a couple articles. Okay, so I have 2 articles made by Huntabyte, and I should be able to delete my own article. So I can delete this one here, and we can see that that is now deleted. And then if I log out, I can no longer see those action buttons. And if I log in as another user, so let's just make another user. So now we're logged in as Byte, and I can create articles here as well. And then I can also, of course, delete my own article, but I don't have the ability to take action based on Huntabyte's article here, which is exactly what we want. So now we can wrap this up by protecting the ability to edit articles, and we can do so inside of the article ID page here. This is where our edit article page is and where the form is. So we can go inside of the load function first, and what we'll do is we'll first just throw if the user is not authenticated, because we know they have to at least be authenticated to access this page. So we'll follow our normal process here of validating and getting the user and the session. And then we'll need to edit our get article function here. And what we'll do here is we'll take in a user ID, which can be a string. And then just as we did with the delete article section, if there is an article, we want to check if article.userid is not equal to user.userid, then we want to throw an error that they are unauthorized to edit this article. And then we'll just need to pass in the user.userid here. So now we shouldn't be able to access the edit pages of articles that we do not own. So again, with the update article, we'll go ahead and copy this here. So you're starting to recognize a bit of a pattern here. Then again, similar to the delete, we need to actually make sure that we have this article. So what we'll do is we'll say article, we'll find unique with row where the ID is number params.article ID, and that's coming from the route params. And then we'll check to make sure that the article.userid, if it doesn't match our user.userid, we want to throw an error because they are unauthorized to edit the article. And then otherwise, we should be good to go here. So let's just go ahead and test this out. So I can edit this article here. I'm logged in as Byte right now, so I can edit this article. And you can see that it was successfully edited. I saw that it was article ID 4 in the browser. So let's just log out as Byte and log back in as Huntabyte, which is a different user. And if I try to go to article 4, we'll see them getting unauthorized, right? But I can definitely still access my own article, which is article 3. So we have successfully added authorization and authentication to our Prisma CRUD application. So I hope you found this video informative. If you did, I'd greatly appreciate it if you drop a like. It lets YouTube know that you're a hardcore coder and that you want to see more of my content. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.